We, I believe, have made our way to chapter 4. We were looking at Cain and Abel. Yeah, just Feynman, or not just, but Sonny and Arlene Feynman. Yeah. So we went through like up to this point, like where the of Cain and Abel, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground, and I feel like we got through most of that story. Am I right? I feel like that's the case, right? Yeah, right there. Like Cain's complaining. Oh yeah, because we ended with sort of he's appealing, and God actually takes the appeal, which is itself amazing. My crime is greater than I can bear, or something like that. You've expelled me from the face of the ground today. I'll be hidden from your presence. I'll be a roamer and a rover on the earth, and anyone who finds me will kill me. And Adonai said to him, therefore, anyone who kills Cain, he'll be avenged sevenfold. He'll get 7 times worse, which presumably means I'm like that whoever does it will be like Cain killed one guy, but I'm taking out like your entire family or something like that. Therefore, Adonai set a sign for Cain, so anyone who would find him would not strike him. Now, what that is isn't stated, right? Like, what's the sign that will protect Cain? We don't know. If you look at like medieval art or Renaissance art, he like sometimes will like have a horn or something like that. There'll be an indicator to anyone that, oh, that guy you're not supposed to kill. He's the one with the horn. The word used for it in Hebrew is that God says, Vayasem Hashem lakain ot he put an oat, a sign on him. You know the word oat from Vishamru. Oti leolam, oti leolam, oti le. That oat, it's that Shabbat is a sign between God and Israel that there's a covenant that will last forever, that we have a permanent relationship, and Shabbat is a sign of that relationship, like a ring is a sign of a relationship. Shabbat is a sign of that relationship. So it's an oat, but it also means letter. So it could be in a sign, like the horn, or it could mean a letter, like a letter, sorry, somebody knocking, like A, B, C, D, or Aleph, Bet, Gimel. So Rashi says it's a letter that God gives Cain, and that it's literally like a letter of God's name. So it's like a yud or a hey or something like on his forehead or whatever that he walks around with. So something like this. 16, and Cain went out from God's presence, from Adonai's presence, and lived in the land of roving, the land of Nod, east of Eden. Now transition to something else. Now, verse 17 brings a question that everyone likes to ask. And Cain knew his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Hanoch, to Enoch. So the obvious question is, where does he get his wife? Rashi says that each birth that Eve had were twins, because it's easier just to read it directly from Rashi. So, which is a way of saying, like, obviously, this isn't a modern question. It's a question that they've been asking for centuries. When Cain is born, after Cain is born, the next line is chapter 4, verse 2. It says, and she added, giving birth to his brother Abel. So why does it say, and she added? The added is not that she added a second birth, it's that there were twins in each time. And also, it says, et achiv et hevel. Et is a word, a preposition that exists in Hebrew that doesn't exist in English. It sometimes is translated as with. Like in the previous verse to that, it says she says, I've created a man, kaniti ish et Adonai, which could be with God. But usually et, that preposition, is not translated. It just indicates that there's like a direct object after it. There's no English equivalent. So usually it's not present in the translation. Occasionally it is, but it's this preposition that exists in Hebrew that just doesn't exist in English. So most people don't translate it, right? In this line it'd be she added giving birth to his brother Abel, but Rashi's reading it as if instead of not translating, so he translates with, right? That and she gave birth with his brother with Abel, and that with is indicating twins. There was a girl each time. That would mean no matter what, he's marrying his close relative. So yes, sister.
Identical twin, or was it good?
Fraternal, by definition, fraternal. But yeah, or sister, right.
For generations.
Correct. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, so this is the kind of thing that like we like to mock, but look at the genealogies of the crowned heads of Europe, right into the 20th century, right? Like they're marrying pretty close relatives. A, B, we know in, if you look at like Cleopatra has married her brother, like that stuff goes on. And among Jews, it definitely went on. When we did this morning, we did this in this room, and one person, I won't out them, said, oh yes, both my grandparents, I had two grandparents who married first cousins, right? That stuff was not unusual.
Not to throw anybody under the bus, Allison's got a similar story.
Yeah.
Question on that next time.
Right, next time we do say
my father's generation.
Yeah.
Some of his distant cousins married first cousins.
Yeah.
My grandmother had her maiden name and her married name were the same. So I don't know if they were first cousins.
Right,
I never got the fact on that. But
right.
She was
not uncommon. Definitely not uncommon to have the distant like fifth cousins, Franklin and Eleanor stuff, but
I wouldn't assume they weren't first cousins.
I've been doing some family tree history, and I've tracked to some of the places in Europe where my ancestors were from. And there's a fellow on Long Island who's done a lot of research in the same towns. And all the Jews in this village are all related if you're far enough back.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing because there were a finite number of Jews, and they were there for hundreds of years, and they're all related.
right. So twisted roots. Yeah. So that anyway, Cain definitely marries his sister. There's another answer we can have later, a little bit later on, but yeah, the assumption is if you want to stay within the words of the story, she had twins each time. If you want to say outside of the words of the story, which you sort of have to do by the time you get to the end of this very verse, I think even the original readers didn't take it literally, that you're not supposed to imagine that there's no one else on earth. You're supposed to imagine that this is just the story we're following, but that the world is populated.
Is there another creation going on somewhere else?
We'll get it. Well, it's not even that. It's that don't think of it so literally, which you know is the case. Look back at this verse that we're on, chapter 4, verse 17. And Cain knew his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch, Hanoch. And he was a builder of a city, and he called the name of the city like the name of his son, Hanoch. So if he's a builder of a city,
Cain was the builder of the city.
right? But like there like the point of a city is that there are people in it.
Yeah.
So again,
China,
right.
they got empty cities.
Right. So in general, yeah. So there's a few things going on there. One, it seems to assume there are other people. Two, by the way, why does Cain want to live in a city? Remember the curse earlier in the chapter. Your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground, God says. And now you're cursed from the ground that opened its mouth to take your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it won't continue to give its potency to you. You'll be a roamer and a rover on the earth. So like the sort of takeaway is, can he be a farmer? No, because the ground isn't going to work for him anymore. So move to the city or build a city. Become a builder. Use the ground a different way. Really. So in one sense, it's the fulfillment of that curse. In another sense, it breaks the curse because, of course, the whole point is that he's supposed to be a roamer on the earth. And if you're living in a city, that means that you're like settled in a place.
And then he did all right.
So he seems to have done all right, folks. Well, two things. He's the founder of cities, which is a thing, right? Like that's a accomplishment. But we'll go through his genealogy here, and then they'll disappear. Adam and Eve are going to have another son, Seth, and it seems all of humanity is going to come from Seth. That's the line that we're going to follow. We're going to get
All of humanity except for the fact that the world is populated.
well, right, exactly. But there's and there's going to be another bottleneck at Noah, right? But yes.
Rabbi, if I recall, you don't hear about Cain anywhere else.
Cain disappears from the text, yeah. But
Really what happened, so.
no, we'll go through by the time we get to the weird ending of chapter 5, beginning of 6. There are some theories as to what happens to the descendants of Cain. So he founds a city, also part of a possible, some see biblical skepticism for cities. The heroes of Israel generally have a standard profession. What does Abraham seem to do? Shepherd. Isaac, shepherd. Jacob, shepherd. Joseph becomes an administrator, but also leads everyone into slavery. The guy who's going to lead them out of slavery, what's Moses' job? Shepherd. Works for his father-in-law, right? King David, shepherd. So there's a bias towards the rural pastoral life, and cities. Cain builds is the founder of cities. Babel will be the next city, the builders of the tower, also a city. And of course, the great cities of Egypt, right? So there's an urban skepticism that goes on. Obviously, over history, most Jews will become sort of the urban people par excellence on the globe, but the Bible, I think, is skeptical of cities and sees cities as corrupting, and the rural life as more as better to connect.
Rabbi, is there any significance to a shepherd versus a farmer? Shepherds deal with animals.
The shepherd was being used literally?
I think often it is used literally, because specifically I think of like Jacob's family tends to be shepherds, and when they move to Egypt, it's a thing. When like there's no food left in Canaan, they have to go to Egypt. The Egyptians allegedly would worship lambs as gods, and Joseph says, you can't live near them because they're going to be totally offended by your lifestyle. You have to live somewhere else, and the Egyptians won't eat with the Israelites. So it seems that the whole lifestyle is objectionable to Egyptians. So it seems that it's literally shepherds. So anyway, Cain founds a city, and he gives birth to Enoch, which isn't, again, you don't get it in the English. In Enosh, in Hebrew, it's the word for like mortal man. It's like Adam means human. Cain names Adam's grandson like mortal man. Like it's sort of like it has the same root as weak, so it has that like sense of like not being strong. So that's why there's like a hint of mortality. And so the fact that there's a hint of mortality in the name is appropriate for Cain, who also invented murder. Well, yeah, so it'll keep going from here. You'll know, so he does. And And Irad was born to Hanoch, to Enoch. And Irad fathered Mahayael, and Mahayael fathered Methusael. Methusael fathered Lamech. And Lamech took 2 wives. Lamech apparently, obviously there are wives before then, they're just not mentioned. This isn't the complete story. It's a patriarchal society. They follow the patriarchal line. So
Is this the first one to take 2 wives though?
yes, well, it seems to be, because it's like, no, you assume that like if it's noting something, then that's it. Like we know that Adam had a wife, as it were, and Cain knew his wife. So these other guys clearly had wives because they're fathering children. It's just that they're not relevant to the story, as it were. Lamech has 2 wives. One's name was Adah, and the second's name was Zillah. And Adah gave birth to Yovel. He was the father of tent dwellers and cattlemen. So again, you see sort of like this, right.
This isn't
So-
a spiritual message.
So there are a couple of things going on here. One, I want to note Alter's message.
Time passes in these last like 10 lines.
Yeah. This is right. Suddenly, from like where we were like zeroed in
6 or 7 generations.
on a conversation about a piece of fruit
Yeah.
and like going line by line, suddenly we're like traversing thousands of years. Right. Sometime later, ... There's just a screen wipe,
Yeah.
and you're yes, definitely. Alter will note this for the beginning of chapter 5, but he says, like, nothing reveals the difference of the biblical conception of literature from later Western ones more strikingly than the biblical use of genealogies as intrinsic elements of literary structure. So, first of all, he notes that this is like the one thing that you notice is slightly different. The biblical authors think that this is essential to the story. And Western readers are like, ugh, another list of begats. So he says, quotes others that these are carefully placed compositional units that mark off one large narrative segment from another. So one is like a chapter division in a sense, like an oral chapter division, that this prehistory part is ending and we're moving on to something else. This is going to be this like marks the division between the stories of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah. And then you can get another one between Noah and Abraham. Notes also that these are linked thematically with the initial injunction to be fruitful and multiply. So one, the sort of like promise of God, be fruitful and multiply, is here being fulfilled. They're multiplying and they're having kids and things like this, and that'll be even more apparent in the next chapter. And it also contrasts with the rest of Genesis, where these guys are just having kids. Does Abraham and Sarah just have kids? No, it's this whole drama. Do Isaac and Rebecca just have kids? No, it's this whole drama. Do Jacob and Rachel just have kids? No, it's this whole drama. There's also a contrast going on between like the ease of being fruitful and multiplying for these folks and the struggles of the matriarchs. So that's also going on. Also, you'll see that Cain has 7 generations, 7 being a very specific number. There'll be 10 generations total from Adam to Noah, and 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. So part of that also is that the sense that there's a God in control. This isn't random stuff. Like the idea is partly that to teach that the world isn't happening randomly, but by design, and the fact that it's all sort of neatly ordered teaches that. So that's one thing. The other thing is that as Jonathan Sarna notes that that most of the guys, like these sort of inventions, and you'll see there are more coming. In most other societies surrounding them are the gifts of the gods. So I'm gonna like go through the whole list, but it's a silent polemic against the mythological concepts of the ancient world, to attribute the advance of culture to divine or semi-divine figures. In Mesopotamia, there was a Apakalu, a half fish, half man, who rose out of the sea to reveal to man the sciences, the social system, writing, and art. In Lil, the air god created farming tools. In the god of watery chaos was associated with magic, wisdom, and arts and crafts and music. For Egyptians, it was the god Thot, who invented the scales and balances, Osiris, who taught humans agriculture and the arts of life, Ptah, who is a patron of artists, artificers, and men of letters. In Ugaritic and Phoenicia, Koshar gave humans smithing skills, iron, such. In Greece, it was Athena who invented the plow and the rake, and Apollo founded towns, invented the flute and lyre, etc., etc. Everything that's significant comes from the gods. Note here, who invented the city? Cain. Who invents all of these sort of like these things? And then look at the next line. The Yaval was a tent dweller and cattleman, and his brother was Yuval. He was the father of every player of lyre and pipe. And Zillah too gave birth to Tubal Cain, forger of every implement of bronze and iron. Right. So here, who's inventing all the stuff? People. So if you want to, the polemic is twofold. One, this stuff doesn't come from the gods. It comes from people. Two, this is just a theory, somewhat mine, that if you think that all great advances come from the gods, then you think that I'm not capable of it, or that if Stephen invents something, like, it's probably not the real deal because really important things come from the gods. But if you think that people do it, then you know that people can make great advances. So why does this random weird tribe in the Middle East have an outsized influence on the rest of humanity, whereas most of these other groups like come and go? Part of it could be this. And it's almost like, I think, we like talk about this sort of thing. It's like in America, right? Like just sort of like the American idea is partly that like we can govern ourselves. You don't need kings and queens to do it, right? Like, and that sort of like can-doism of like, it can be us, like informs just the American character. And like, why do like more inventions and things like this come out of this culture? It's probably not an accident, right? There's a creativity in it. And I think that creativity is also here, that there was like a push because the stories they told were of human ingenuity and not things being given from the gods.
That's interesting. Do you see any parallel with, you know, the whole startup nation concept in Israel and being a Jewish state? And
Yeah, so so to a certain extent, yes. I mean, not like directly from here, but if you have an ethos of we have to do it ourselves. So in modern Israel, it's less coming from the Tanakh, say, and more from, well, we know like societies that are dependent on resources, you know, the Saudis and the Russians for that matter, like sort of enrich themselves by mining the ground. And if you're dependent, if you don't have oil like Israel, and you have to figure out like how are we going to make a living, you have to think of how are we going to make a living, and it drives creativity.
But other places that have been resource limited have not
had that. Correct. Yes. So
like Bangladesh.
Right. So what is it? Obviously, you need certain circumstances. If Israel had, monsoons, but it might be different. But yeah, but I do think so. I think there's a cultural thing. It's a cultural thing that's here, and I think in a different sense, it's a cultural thing, like in the United States, part of.
I've often read that it's not as much Jewish culture, but Ashkenazi culture. What do you think about
that? I mean, for this stuff,
in Israel,
yeah, in Israel,
because even Jewish IQs are different with Ashkenazi Jews
than Sephardi.
They're higher with the Ashkenazi Jews.
Maybe it's all that inbreeding we're talking about. No, actually, the same thing was going on in Sephardic cultures, but like the inbreeding wise. So I don't know. That I can't answer for.
There's no answer. I didn't know if you
Yeah.
thought about it.
I haven't like but that this sort of like sense of that is in human hands, I think is influential, with the irony there being that now people read the Bible and think it's about submitting yourself to God, and humanism is ignoring God. Whereas here, like I'm saying that like sort of in the original, it might have been almost the opposite, that holding to these stories gave you more of a belief in human ingenuity than what your neighbors had.
Do you think that's anything to do with the cultural aspect of maybe Jews are given more of an entrepreneurial spirit to discover and fend and create for themselves, as opposed to other cultures that rely on things to be given to them?
Right. So I mean, so there's a lot of like twists and turns of history that can feed into that. Like from this base, I feel like it makes it more possible, right? And part of that is you're supposed to have a sense of make it work for yourself. Some of the biblical heroes like Joseph will be guys who like think their way around a problem. So
Perhaps there's a combination, because certainly in Eastern Europe, the options for Jews are so limited, where in Arab countries they are more expansive in the Middle Ages. So if you combine your thinking with your comment, it can give rise, your options are limited, and you have this sort of
right, we got to make it work.
background that would give rise to the
Right. Yeah. So yeah.
I hate to point this out. I mean, I don't disagree with anything anyone was saying about the ingenuity, but I feel like chronologically, I mean, we're like one page away from
Adam. Right.
all this great stuff that's happening, and about like one more page, it's like, you guys all suck, and we need to wipe it all out because this is not working.
Oh yeah. These, but I'm saying like this stuff, like what's like really in what's the significance of like some of these genealogical lists that like our eyes all glaze over at? Like my point is that there's it's setting out the idea that people are supposed to do this, and that's like they'll be part of Israelite thinking, is that the things aren't gifts from gods. Things are like we're supposed to have this great appreciation of life and the world and what have you, but these advances aren't gifts from gods, but rather they're part of what we're supposed to develop. So
I was just saying, it seems like to put it in another context, like God is the ultimate referee.
right.
He puts everybody on the field, and you play your game, you create your things, you make your plays, and then he decides you're ejected.
Right. That's definitely the case. They will be ejected for roughing the planet.
Your theory, you can see a distinction with Christianity and Islam. Christianity is based upon a concept of recognizing the Savior,
Right.
and Islam is submission.
Right. But it's submission. The word means submission.
So
Yeah.
you can see that distinction among the
Yeah.
three of
Correct.
religions.
And right.
But this is in Jewish.
Well, this is what we'll give birth to.
Mankind.
Correct. Though it's the Israelites' story of the creation of mankind, the surrounding cultures will have different stories.
But this is the one we kept more than anyone else. The Christians have modified it to some extent. Islam has modified it to some extent, but this is.
Are there other Jewish time periods that are accepted?
Are there Jewish what?
Other Jewish chronicles?
No.
This time period, or
The chapter 4 and 5 of Genesis.
that's it?
Period. Right. Yeah. You'll have like midrashim that will fill out these stories that come later, but they're meant to supplement rather than replace. Yeah. So you're right. Yaval will invent a liar and the right. So Yuval was a father of a tent dweller and cattleman, and his brother's name was Yuval. He's the father of every player of lyre and pipe. Lyre being, this little stringed instrument, the only stringed instrument, I think, in the Tanakh. David will play one, and Kinor. And 21, and Ugav, sort of pipe, a flute. Those pop up in Psalm 150. You might know meaning for Ugav. And Zillah too gave birth to Tubal Cain, forger of every implement of bronze and iron. And again, like sort of like that's significant. Like these things are like human forms rather than gifts from God. And Tubal Cain's sister was Naamah, which is weird because no woman's been mentioned like except as a wife of. She's just thrown out there without any like clear reason for it. Like presumably there are other sisters. Like what's so special about her? Doesn't say. Probably the original readers knew all of this and they didn't need it. They just sort of like they could hear the name and the whole story they would know it. But we don't have that. That's just lost to history. Rashi gives an answer. Rashi says, why does it say Naamah? He says, he Eshet Noah. Noah's wife, Naamah. Why is she mentioned? Rabbis hate, the sages hate having anonymity in the Torah. So why is Naamah mentioned? It doesn't say. So Rashi gives the answer. It's Noah's wife. She's Mrs. Noah. Because if you think of it, Eve is famous for, she gets her name, she's the mother of all the living. But really, Mrs. Noah is the mother of all the living because the whole society bottlenecks at the Noah story. And that family is the only one to survive. So she's the mother of everyone alive. But she doesn't even have a name. Seems like a big oversight. Rashi steps in, no, it's not an oversight. She's just earlier, you just didn't notice it. So Naamah. I have a children's book. It's floating somewhere in this building that we read to the kids. There's a midrash that Naamah was Mrs. Noah. And that's before the flood. While Noah was gathering all the animals, Naamah, it's a children's book, put on an apron with many pockets, and she collected all the seeds. She went around to all the flowers and all the plants and collected all the seeds, so that while Noah was saving all the animals, she saved all the plants, and then they went on the ark. So that's Naamah, means pleasant. It's a nice one, like and now it gets violent. 3, and Lamech said to his wives, remember he's the one with 2 wives. Ada and Zillah, listen to my voice. Wives of Lamech, hear what I say. For I've killed a man for a wound to me, and a boy for a hurt to me. For Cain will be avenged 7-fold, and Lamech 77-fold. What this means, we don't know. It's the first poem, like straight up poem in the Bible. It's a perfect example of biblical poetry. Biblical poetry, another of Alter's other main specialty, is noted by parallelism, where you say the same thing twice, slightly differently. So notice this line. If you look at that poem, he says, Ada and Zillah, listen to my voice. A. B. Wives of Lamech, hear what I say. It's saying the same thing twice, slightly differently, right? Ada and Zillah are the wives of Lamech. Listen to my voice, hear what I say. Same thing twice, like just in English poems rhyme.
More than 2 wives.
Well, so he says he has 2 wives. The text tells us he has 2 wives. So biblical in English we like rhyme poems or whatever. In Hebrew, in the Bible, rather than rhyming, you say a similar thing twice, and that's sort of the skill of the poet. For I've killed a man for a wound to me, and a boy for a hurt to me. That's saying the same thing. I've killed a man and hurt a boy. It seems men and boys are different things, but this could be some trash talk like that. He looks like a man, but when I fought him, he was just a boy. For a wound to me, for a hurt to me. Cain was avenged 7-fold and Lamech 77-fold. Not clear what it means. It might mean something like, I killed a guy, what Rashi thinks it means that he killed Cain, and that he's upset that he killed Cain, that he was hunting in the woods and took a shot. Remember how some say that Cain, the mark of Cain was a horn. So if he's in the woods and he sees a thing with a horn and he's hunting, and accidentally it's Cain. So Cain, who like had this protection, it didn't work because it wasn't a good sign to have.
This is like 7 generations later.
Well, Cain, these guys have long lives.
I know that. What is Cain doing hunting?
Right. Don't go for a walk in the woods. This is yeah. So it goes
He's a builder city.
At the age of
He hasn't built the
500.
city.
the age of 500. So that's Rashi.
To get supplies to build a city.
He doesn't go, by that, he's gotta have people to do all that.
There's only a half a dozen people around.
He's 500 years old.
The
A young 500.
They gave birth early.
Yeah. So so Rashi thinks that this was a hunting accident. But it's something, and again, these are probably snippets that the original audience knew really well, and we only have the snippets that survived, that made it into the text. It seems like it was. I mean, he's saying, I killed a guy, and now God's going to get me.
Right, but the second recorded.
Right, the second recorded murder. Yes. So that's Lamech. He kills a guy, and then we just drop the topic, verse 25, and Adam again knew his wife, and she gave birth to a son, and she called his name Seth.
Okay, so how old are they? Adam, still alive.
Well, we don't know if this is consecutive or not, but it's clearly a replacement. It says because God placed another seed for me in place of Abel because Cain killed him.
So this could be a flashback.
Right, so it could be a flashback, like as a transition into the next chapter, which will do that. Right. God has granted me other seed in place of Abel, for Cain has killed him. So that's the Seth. Seth means like planted or set. As for Seth, to him too a son was born, and he called his name Enosh, similar to but not identical to his cousin. Right. It's a chet instead of it's a shin instead of a chet, or chafli. So it's almost the same but not quite the same. It was then that the name of the Lord was first invoked, which is this odd ending to it. Az hochil likro b'shem Adonai. It seems that the idea is at that point in time, it seems people begin calling out to God. It's like the birth of what we would call a religious impulse.
Worship.
Even though those sacrifices came before, it's not clear like what those sacrifices mean. This is like specifically calling out by God's name, which is important maybe at least two ways. One, that the original state of things is that they actually recognize God as God, because the rest of the book is going to be freaked out about idolatry and worshiping false gods. And so this is saying we started out on the right path, I guess.
So this is the birth of religion.
Something like that.
A whole new industry.
And in addition to all of the like inventing iron in cities and tent dwelling and cattle herding. And in Exodus 6, God will say, Yod-Heh Vav-Heh will say, I never revealed myself as Yod-Heh Vav-Heh to the ancestors. I'm doing it to you, Moses.
Gabby, did you mention, I think you mentioned there's difference between Adonai.
Yes.
And here it's Adonai.
Mm-hmm.
Which is Adonai?
So Yod-Heh Vav-Heh is, we pronounce Adonai, is the name used in chapters 2, 3, and 4. And chapter 5 will zip back to Elohim, the other name for God. And that is, which means just God, right? It could be a generic lowercase g or uppercase g. So this is, they're calling on God by God's proper name, Yod-Heh Vav-Heh. Consistent with the fact that in Genesis, most of the patriarchs will mostly relate to God as Elohim and not as Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And all of their names will reflect that. Like they'll be like Rachel, like names that have L in them will be common in Genesis. And later on, they'll begin to have Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh worked into them, like Eliyahu or Yirmiyahu, or et cetera, et cetera.
So we were growing up, we were taught that we never pronounced Yud Hey Vav Hey.
Right. So that's why,
Properly.
correct. So we're not, right. So it knows, you look, some translators will, or in scholarly papers, they will. They'll pronounce it, they'll put in the vowels that they think go there.
Well, to me, it looks a lot like Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's-
They're doing, that's what they're doing. They're doing the Yud as a J, because that's how it would have been written in German, where the J makes a Y sound. So, so that gets transferred over to English, where it makes a different sound, but that's why they're putting a J there. But they definitely have the vowels wrong. Meaning that in traditional Tanachim and traditional Sidurim, they would print Yud Hey Vav Hey, but they would put the vowels for saying the word Adonai there to remind you that these are the letters, but we're actually pronouncing this other way. So they're put in, so they're using like the wrong vowels for it. They're definitely pronouncing it wrong. Scholars pronounce it differently.
So do we know how to pronounce it?
Have
Have we ever heard it?
we haven't heard it. I think I know how to pronounce it. I haven't, and I won't. But there are clues around, and I actually am of the opinion you'll see it printed. Scholars will print a name for God, but I actually don't think they have it right. But you're right. Traditionally, it's not pronounced, and we, in its place, say Adonai, which means my Lord. It like would translate saying my Lord. Like the Lord of the Manor or whatever, like so we're using a substitute word. And then also in Yeshiva, you use Hashem, the name. You say the name, so you don't use the name that you're substituting for the name. It's very meta at that point. Oh, that's what we say, so we don't pronounce the name that we don't pronounce, Yes.
So you go your whole life and never hear
Right.
Correct. Yeah. So
Well, you think you know what it
it.
is.
Yeah. Right. So the
And it's been going on for thousands of years.
And how do
Well,
you
it's
say,
the-
Yud Hey what?
Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. So
That's
the
YH.
YHVH, yeah. So you see he and he, both in Alter translates the Lord, which is the translation not of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, which is a name. It's like Dave. It's a name. It's but it's
But they say Bob.
correct. So that's God's name, but the English convention is to translate the Lord, but you're really translating Adonai, which isn't God's name. It's a substitute for God's name. So they pronounce the Lord, and that's sort of what is generally done. Fox and Friedman are like, well, that's not really right, because the Lord isn't the thing, it's an actual name. So as opposed to a title, the Lord. So they put, but they're like, but you're not supposed to say it. So they put in YHVH in all caps. Be like, this is what it is, but then you can't pronounce it, which is sort of funny because it's like the point, which is that you can't really pronounce it.
Walter does that too.
Right.
In his note,
Yeah, it says,
YHWH.
yeah, right. So so that Art School puts in Hashem, again, the name. So there are different ways of doing it.
All a reference without actually saying it.
Which is a I don't know, part of it is, like
It's interesting.
yeah, you can't quite nail it down.
I didn't realize Adonai literally means Lord.
Yes. So like Adon Olam is Lord of the world. You're using it there not as a name, but as a title. Right. And so if you want, I'll give you I'll do this much. Technically, all of these letters, the yud, hey, vav, think of it not as a vowel, but as like the vav, hey, they're as close to vowel letters as you can get in Hebrew, right? That if you were to pronounce yud, hey, vav, hey, you could just do it as could just be breathing, which is if the name of God is just, it'd be a really cool thing that all of this like arguments over God's name, when really it's like just what gives us life, daily life, every moment is like every breath, like every breath should praise God. Maybe it's just this. So that's one way of approaching it. Yud is just a way of not writing yud hey vav hey. So yud or hey with a apostrophe is sort of what you do, because traditionally you don't throw away any papers with God's name on it. So I have a setting on my computer that whenever yud hey vav hey pops up, that it should change to a hey with a chick chick, so that it doesn't, so that I don't accidentally print out God's name. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So you don't do that though. Digitally, the idea is that because it's not actually written, that it's just pixels, like you don't have to worry about it. So you don't have to like put your phone in a Geniza afterwards. All right. So that brings us to the end of chapter 4, which is the end of the line of Cain. Cain never makes an appearance in the Bible again. Eve never makes an appearance in the Bible again. Adam will pop up in poems. But that line isn't mentioned, and we start something new with chapter 5.